Hello, my name is Malik Jabbar, author of the book The Astrological Foundation of the Christ Myth in 4 volumes. The subject that I want to discuss with you today is biblical proof that Jesus Christ was a sun god. A major premise of my book is that Jesus Christ was a sun god and that the gospel stories are based on solar symbolism. Now, during the course of this presentation, I will present some biblical proofs that much of the Bible is based on cosmic mythology. I will bring forth various quotations of verses from the Bible and give the astro-theological interpretation of these biblical verses. Now, this leads us into the realm of astrotheology. So before I can present proofs that the Bible is a work of mythology based on astrotheology, I need to explain some of the fundamentals of astrotheology so that we can get the best understanding possible. And that is why we have this graphic before us, which I would use to facilitate that explanation. But basically, the definition of astrotheology is star religion. Star religion is a form of ancient religion that was based on the movement of the sun through the celestial heavens, whereas the sun was personified or symbolized as a god or a deity, and the various regions of the sky that the sun passed through were metaphorically represented as earthly locations, or as in some cases heavenly locations. But the stories were constructed so as to describe the deity in a somewhat personified fashion and intermixed or associated with the affairs of humans. Now, I will use the graphics before us to explain exactly how ancient astrotheology worked, and also how it is yet reflected in our modern religions. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is our focus. But we can already see, when we look back in the history of the ancient myths, ancient Egyptian myths and Greek myths, we see elements of astrotheology, because they were all based on astrotheology. We know that the ancient Egyptian god Ra was a sun god, and the other deities and gods associated with Ra, Horus, Set, and others, they were somehow associated with the sun. So we see a reflection of the cosmos within the ancient Egyptian religion. And the same thing with the Greeks. We know Zeus was a sky god, and his brother Hades was the god of the underworld, and Poseidon was the god of the sea. And when we look at all of the various ancient religions, we see some type of association with the cosmos and with the environment, with nature. And this really is the basis of astrotheology. It's reflective of the cosmos, nature, and other such associated things. So now my objective here is to prove beyond any rational doubt within the short duration of this presentation that the system of astrotheology is intimately embedded within the biblical scriptures, and that the life of Jesus Christ in the Bible is actually symbolism of a 1-year cycle of the sun as it passes from its birth, so to speak, on through its life and eventually to its death at the winter solstice. And so I would use this graphic, as I said before, to help explain this premise. And so at this point, perhaps I should give a little explanation of what we're looking at here. And basically, what astrotheology, what the system involves. But what we're looking at here is the starry sky that we see in the various constellations of the sky. And this particular graph is a spherical form of that, because looking from the Earth out into the sky is reflected to us as from a spherical perspective, because the Earth is a sphere. And over here is what we call a Mercator projection of the sky. That's simply saying that we flatten out this representation in order, for illustration purposes, to make us so that we can better understand what we're looking at. And I should mention also that what we have down here in this section is a cutout of the zodiac band, the pathway of the sun through the cosmos in the course of 1 year. The sun actually travels, as we know, in the course of 1 year through the zodiac. It doesn't touch the whole sky. The zodiac band is about 18-20 degrees wide. And this right here represents that zodiac band, just to give us a better illustration of the sun's path through the sky in 1 year. Now basically, what we need to know in order to get a good understanding of astrotheology, we need to understand the astronomical divisions of the sky. And once we understand those divisions, then we can follow with an understanding of how those divisions affect astro-theological interpretations. So let's use this portion to get an understanding of those divisions. Now we see here vertical, 12 vertical lines, or 12 vertical sections, I should say. These are representative of the zodiacal sections of the sky. There are 12 different zodiacal sections, starting with Aries, Taurus, Gemini, etc. Each time the sun is in a particular section, zodiacal section, it reflects certain meanings that refer to the zodiac sign of that section or other elements of that section. Now the zodiac band, as I'm showing you down here, it's only about 20 degrees wide, but the entire viewing section of the sky that we're able to see at a given time actually covers 180 degrees. So actually, say if the sun is in this particular section, when it comes to astrotheological interpretation, the meaning that would be transposed astro-theologically, it would not just reflect the zodiacal band, but rather any stars within this whole region, 180 degree region, not just the zodiacal region, which only expands about 20 degrees wide. Now, the actual path of the sun is represented by this curved line. And this straight line is representative of the celestial equator. Now that goes for the same up here. From A to B, this straight line represents the celestial equator. And we know the path of the sun, it spends some time up above the celestial equator. And this space up above the celestial equator is the northern hemisphere. And then below the celestial equator, this space below the celestial equator is the southern hemisphere. And in the mythology, when the sun is above the celestial equator in the northern hemisphere, generally the symbolism reflected from the sun's presence in this region will be positive. The sun will be in triumph. The sun will be in its glory, so to speak. But when it's below the celestial equator in the southern hemisphere, this is when we get interpretations that show negative aspects of the sun's journey, captivity, persecution, suffering, and so forth. That the mythology will show that type of interpretation when the sun is in the lower regions in the southern hemisphere. Now we also have inflection points or intersections when the sun passes from region to region. This is also reflected in the mythology. Now, when the sun intersects, or I should say when the ecliptic, this curved line here, it really represents the ecliptic. That's the path of the sun as it goes through the sky during the course of a year. And when the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator, it crosses at what is called the equinox, either the vernal equinox or the autumnal equinox. Now we see right here, as the curved line crosses the celestial equator and is going down, that indicates the autumnal equinox, the fall equinox. The sun is going down into the southern hemisphere. And when we get to this intersection within astrotheological symbolism, it's going to indicate perhaps capture or trouble or suffering of some type, because the sun is passing from one region into a negative region, we could say, or a region that represents suffering or what have you. Now, when the sun is coming up from the southern hemisphere and going up into the northern hemisphere, it passes through this intersection. This is the vernal equinox, or the spring equinox. This is going to indicate resurrection. It's going to indicate some type of positive transformation in the astrotheological symbolism. Now you can see this over here, also like over here, this line going here on this spherical representation. This straight line is representing the ecliptic, and this other parallel line is representing the celestial equator. This is one reason that we're giving you the Mercator representation, because you can actually see the movement of the ecliptic in a much better fashion when it's spread out on a flat projection. But basically, it's what's most important that we understand in the symbolism that the ancients pen in their mythological stories. That region above the celestial equator was written in their stories as reflecting positive elements, and that region below the celestial equator reflected negative elements. And I should mention also, I explained the equinoxes are represented by the intersections. At the top of the curve, that's representing the summer solstice. At the very peak, when the sun hits its peak before it descends and goes toward its intersection with the celestial equator here, which would indicate going into the lower regions, the autumnal equinox. At its highest region is at the summer solstice. At its lower region of the curve is at the winter solstice. So when it ascends from the winter solstice, gradually going back toward the equinox, it's in a negative, it's in the negative hemisphere, but it's headed, that's like a resurrection. We know that winter solstice represents resurrection for the sun, or rebirth of the sun, toward that, going back toward the north. So those are basics, understandings that we need to have in terms of the divisions of the sky and the sun's pathway through the sky during a given during a year, during a cycle of a year, because most of the symbolism that we discuss in the Bible, it really will be reflective of the pathway of the sun through the sky in the course of 1 year. Now I think we're ready to make some connections between the Bible and astrotheology. And our focus is the Gospels and Jesus, and proof that Jesus is a sun god according to the Bible. So the best place to start is with the birth of Jesus and the biblical description of the birth of Jesus. According to the Bible, Jesus was born when he was born, according to description of the circumstances of his birth. In Luke of the Bible and other portions of the Bible, it says that when he was born, that there were shepherds in the field abiding taking care of their flock at the time of his birth. Now, this has caused a lot of confusion in the theological world because Jesus' birth is set at December 25th, and shepherds do not attend their flocks in the field during the winter. And December 25th is approximate to the beginning of winter. So that has never matched the scholars, and it's been a puzzle. And because of this fact, sheep are domesticated animals, and they require human intervention to protect them from predators and to shelter them in the winter and so forth. And in the wintertime, they are installed. They're not in the open fields. But now our focus is Jesus as a sun god. So we want to use this passage from the Bible to connect it with astrotheology. Now, as I mentioned, the winter solstice is at the bottom of the curve, and that indicates the birth of the sun when it makes its pivot and turns and goes back toward the northern hemisphere. The winter solstice comes at December 22, and December 25 is 3 days after the winter solstice. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we examine astrotheology, we look at the whole sector that the sun is in for attributes that the astrotheologists or mythologists in their writings will associate the sun with. And the sun, according to the ancients, was born in Capricorn. So when we look at the sector of Capricorn, for instance, saying, okay, let's look at this sector. This might not be the exact sector of Capricorn. I don't know which one is here. Writing's kind of small, but that doesn't matter. The point is that we're looking at the stars in the entire sector, 180 degrees of stars, and not just Capricorn. Now, within the sector of Capricorn, there are 5 other constellations. There's the constellation Cygnus. There's the constellation of Cepheus. There's the constellation of Delphinus. There's the constellation of Pegasus. And there's the constellation of Equus. These are other constellations found within Capricorn. We know Capricorn is the sea goat. Equus is a small horse, and Pegasus is the flying horse. Delphinus is the dolphin. Cepheus is the king, and Cygnus is the swan. And they all fall within the sector of Capricorn. And Jesus actually representative of the sun. What we need to do is look for some representation which in the sector of Capricorn that will match the Bible verses. Now, the Bible verses say that when Jesus was born, there were shepherds tending their flock. Now, we know, according to astrotheology, that Jesus actually is representing the sun. Jesus is not a historical figure. So when we examine the sector of Capricorn and we examine the names of the stars within the constellation Cepheus, we find two distinct stars that fit the biblical description. One of the stars in Cepheus, his name is Ire, and the other star that helps us in our decipherment is called Alfirk. Alfirk and Ire. Alfirk, Alfirk, and Ire, Errai. Ire, the meaning of that name is shepherd. The meaning of the name Alfirk is flock. So here we see an astrological or astrotheological association between the birth of Jesus as the Son on December 25th and the stars within the sector of Capricorn in which the Sun is born. And the Sun, of course, equaling Jesus in the symbolism. So within that sector of Capricorn, when the Sun hits its rebirth on December 25, those two stars, as the Bible says, the shepherd and the flock, well, two stars whose name are shepherd, Ire, and flock, Alfirk, they are in that sector, which brings accordance to the biblical verses which state that the shepherds were attending their flocks at the birth of Jesus, which actually means at the birth of the Son. So that's a very potent symbolism there. Now, within my books, I give astrological correlations to all of the major phases of the life of Jesus in the gospel. And not only Jesus, the whole Bible is actually based on astrotheology. So we cover the whole Bible, but we are focusing on Jesus in this presentation here. And I'm going to give two or three examples, two or three correlations, so that you can see actually how astrotheological symbolism works. And there's a plethora of correlations within the books, but I'm going to convey enough within this presentation so that you get a feel of the methodology of astrotheology. Now, we covered the birth. We know that when Jesus started out on his mission, he was, as the story goes, baptized by John in the River Jordan at the age of 30, and that inaugurated his mission, his one-year mission to redeem the world or whatever was intended. But now, according to the Bible, in Mark of the Bible and in other of the synoptic Gospels, it mentions that immediately after Jesus was baptized in the Jordan, or crossed the Jordan, he was challenged by the devil. He was challenged by Satan for 40 days. He struggled against Satan because, or I should say the devil. He struggled against the devil because the devil sought to block Jesus from his mission. And this struggle went on for 40 days. The devil seeking to tempt Jesus, to hold him back from going on his mission, to bring redemption to the world. And as I explained earlier, let's look back at our graphic here. Let's look at the lower one here. The pathway of the sun, the ecliptic, is the curved line, as I mentioned earlier, and the straight line represents the celestial equator. Now, in the symbolism that we're referring to, Jesus being baptized in the river Jordan, in this phase of the symbolism, this is actually referring to the celestial equator. And Jesus crossing Jordan is actually the sun crossing the celestial equator. Now, in this phase of the symbolism, we're entering into, in a sense, an agricultural phase of the symbolism. There are various phases to the symbolism, and they're all covered in my books. But actually, what we're dealing with here is seasonal transition. As I indicated earlier in explaining the importance of understanding that the celestial equator actually divides the upper hemisphere from the lower hemisphere. And of course, the ecliptic, as I said, marks the path of the sun. And we have positive elements in the upper hemisphere and negative elements in the lower hemisphere. When the sun passes and goes into the upper hemisphere, when it intersects the vernal equinox, that is officially the start of spring. But spring type weather does not kick in on Earth right at that moment, because it takes time for the seasons to transition from winter weather to spring type weather. It's always a transition period. And the ancients, and even today it holds out, they set holidays or festivals at intervals to announce to the farmers when the transition was complete and it was safe to plant their crops. You will notice that spring, for instance, is March 21. You count 40 days from March 21, you come to the holiday May Day, as it's called today. Anciently, they could have called it by any name pertinent to their culture. The names would vary, but they always place holidays to announce the completion of seasonal transition in the astrotheological symbolism. So, March 21, that's when the sun crosses the vernal equinox. That's when Jesus crosses Jordan within the Bible. But when Jesus crosses Jordan, he has to struggle against Satan for 40 more days before he's free to go on his mission. That is symbolism of the Son having to struggle against the elements of nature, so to speak, for 40 days before it actually reaches the point where the seasonal transition is complete, which is marked by the holiday that we nowadays call May Day. And the same symbolism is in effect when the sun passes down into the lower regions, because the transition, each time the sun passes through the equinoxes and initiates a new season, whether it be from winter to spring, or from summer, from fall, from the beginning of fall, from fall taking hold. Excuse me, I think I said from winter to summer. I mean from winter to spring, and then from summer to fall. At this intersection, which the sun passes on September 22, you count 40 days from September 22, and you come to the holiday of Halloween. So regardless of what it was called 2,000 years ago, when you check out history, and within virtually all cultures, and not all of them, they place holidays 40 days after the sun's crossing of the equinox as a notification that seasonal transition had been completed. So in the Bible, Jesus having this struggle with the devil after he crossed Jordan, Jesus represents the sun in our astrotheological symbolism, and that's the true symbolism, because Jesus is not a historical figure. He's a figure of literature. What that is actually representing is the time for seasonal transition that takes when the sun that takes time to complete after the sun crosses the vernal equinox, or on the other side of the scale, when it crosses the autumnal equinox. Seasonal transition, it takes 40 days. So I think that's another very clear and plain representation there. Okay, I think I'll give one more representation of biblical astrotheology to help clarify the methodology of astrotheology, so that you can have a better idea of what you will encounter if you choose to study my books. But we're taught in the 21st chapter of Matthew of the Bible that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, he went into Jerusalem, and flowers and etc. were laid out before him, and the crowd welcomed him. And he went in riding on 2 asses, if you can imagine that he was riding on 2 asses. I don't know, he riding them both at the same time, or riding one a while and riding the other a while. That's not explained, but it says that he rode into Jerusalem riding on 2 asses, 2 donkeys. Now, as I said, when we study the symbolism, we know that we must study all the stars within a given sector to find an associative meaning for the sun in that particular sector. And we know that in the astrotheology, Jesus, being not his historical figure, actually represents the sun. And in the astrotheology, Jerusalem is defined as being in the sector of Cancer. So, in order to get an explanation of what this actually means about Jesus entering Jerusalem, riding upon two asses, we check the sector of Cancer to find any stars that will enlighten us on what that means. And when we check the sector of Cancer, which only has two constellations to refer to, I'll just mention here that the ancients used 48 constellations in their symbolism. Of course, there's 12 constellations of the zodiac and 36 others scattered throughout the sky that they use in their symbolism. Nowadays, modern astronomy charts through 88 constellations, I believe. But when you're studying ancient symbolism, you go by the 48 that the ancients used. A list of these 48 constellations is in my books. And in fact, book 1 has a list of all the constellations that the ancients used in their symbolism, the stars that were used, and all the information. But anyway, to get back to our point, we look at the sector of Cancer to see what stars the sun crosses or has contact with when it's in the sector of Cancer. And when we check the sector of Cancer, which represents Jerusalem in astro-theological symbolism, we find two stars with significant association with the biblical verses. We find the stars Asellus Borealis and Asellus Australis. Asellus Borealis means northern ass. Asellus Australis means southern ass. So we see that when the sun enters the sector of Cancer, it rides, so to speak, upon two asses as it enters into Jerusalem. So this is pure astro-theological symbolism. And throughout the whole life of Jesus, as depicted in the Bible, his whole life is in the stars. His arrest and capture, as I indicated to you, the intersection at the between the ecliptic and the celestial equator, in some of the symbolism, that's a point of captivity and enslavement, depending on what the focus of the symbolism is. All of these matters are explained in my books, plus all of the various correlations of Jesus' entire life in the Bible and of other prophets. It's shown beyond any reasonable doubt to be based on astro-theology. And I think that's basically what I wanted to cover in this this presentation. But I've written 7 books on the subject of astrotheology. The Astrological Foundation of the Christ Myth in 4 volumes. The Biggest Lie Ever Told. And Lifting the Gnostic Veil. And Secret Origins of Judaism. All of these books deal with astro-theological interpretations and associated interpretations, associated mythological matters as they relate to modern religion. Because in truth, our modern religions have evolved from ancient mythology. And they don't, the stories within our Bible, Quran, Torah, to a great extent, they're based on literature, not actual historical happenings, but poems and epic sagas, and they should not be taken as historically credible. And really, the modern scholars are shouting that from the rooftops nowadays. It's no secret. So you can go to my site, malikjabarbooks.com, and you can read some excerpts of my books and some excerpts from some other notable authors who've written on this subject as well as I have. And you also find links to purchase the books from my site, or you can purchase them from your favorite source. But I thank you for your time.